Ebony Reynolds never imagined that a single flight could turn her world upside down. Yet there she was, seated in first class on a Delta Airlines flight from Atlanta to London, surrounded by suspicious glances, clenched jaws, and frosty smiles that refused to acknowledge her presence. She felt invisible. Whispers spread through the cabin, as if she had somehow trespassed into privileged territory. But what no one knew what would soon change everything was that the unassuming man in 14B reading a worn paperback was none other than the airline's CEO, Raymond Ray Whitmore, and his intervention would transform a nightmarish journey into something extraordinary. Ebony Reynolds had arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport 3 hours before her flight. Like any responsible traveler, she wanted to ensure that there would be no last-minute snags or unexpected delays. She was heading to London to attend a diversity and inclusion conference, an event she had anticipated for months. Representing a budding non-profit organization advocating for young women of color in tech, Ebony took pride in her mission. She was determined to bring back valuable insights and resources, if only she could get there in one piece. The weather forecast that night spoke of storm clouds looming over Atlanta. Ebony trudged through the airport, her carry-on rolling behind her, trying to ignore the soft patter of rain against the glass windows. Her seat assignment was 2A in first class, a treat she had finally decided to gift herself after years of traveling on budget airlines and cramped economy seats. This was a reward for her hard work and dedication. As she neared the check-in counters, Ebony felt a surge of excitement, but also a flicker of apprehension. She had heard stories too many to count of how black women were sometimes treated in upscale settings. But Ebony refused to let fear overshadow her excitement. Clad in a tasteful navy blue pantsuit, she exuded confidence, though her heart fluttered with cautious uncertainty. After all, she was not traveling for leisure or a vacation. She was traveling to make a difference. At the Delta check-in desk, she handed over her passport and ticket confirmation with a polite smile. The agent, a young woman named Jessica, greeted her with professionalism and warmth. Jessica's kind demeanor put Ebony at ease, reassuring her that the journey might actually be smooth. She quickly retrieved Ebony's booking details, confirmed the flight, and politely directed her to the TSA pre-check line. Inside, Ebony breezed through security, comforted by the fact she had prepared meticulously. She had her laptop in an easily accessible case, her liquids in a clear bag, and her identification documents neatly at hand. It felt like everything was in order. For a moment, Ebony believed the usual stress of traveling might bypass her this time. Little did she know the real tribulations would begin as soon as she stepped onto that plane. 2 hours later, Ebony found herself at the Delta Sky Club Lounge, a privilege extended to first-class passengers. It was a plush haven of soft chairs and complimentary refreshments. Large windows offered a wide view of the tarmac, where planes lined up their tail fins, visible in the darkened sky. She settled into a corner seat and allowed the gentle hum of conversation to wash over her. She sipped on an herbal tea, mentally reviewing her keynote talking points for the upcoming conference. As she scrolled through her presentation slides, Ebony couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of conversation around her. Businessmen discussed stock prices in hushed tones. A pair of older women, perhaps heading to Europe for a river cruise, compared notes on hotels and tourist attractions. An affluent couple debated the merits of spending the summer in the Hamptons versus the French Riviera. It was a world Ebony had rarely inhabited, this realm of wealth and access, yet she felt she'd earned her place through her dedication and perseverance. Midway through a quick check of her emails, Ebony caught a glimpse of a tall man at the lounge entrance scanning the seats. He had salt and pepper hair, wore a casual blazer over a crisp white shirt, and carried no more than a small leather backpack. Something about him seemed quietly self-assured. Their eyes met momentarily, and he offered a polite nod, the faintest smile at the corner of his lips. She nodded back, wondering if perhaps he was also headed to London. Before she could dwell on the thought, the lounge intercom announced that her flight, Delta Flight 45, was now boarding. Ebony shut down her laptop, gathered her things, and made her way to the gate, her heart aflutter with optimism for the adventure and learning that awaited her across the Atlantic. Upon arriving at the gate, Ebony was among the first to board. The flight attendants at the plane's entrance greeted her with polite smiles. She spotted her seat 2A near the window, with enough legroom for her to stretch comfortably. She stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and placed her laptop bag beneath the seat in front of her. Settling in, she marveled at the spaciousness. She rarely had the luxury of this much room on a plane. A flight attendant named Monica offered her a warm towel and a pre-flight beverage. Ebony requested a sparkling water with lemon. For a fleeting moment, she felt the subtle thrill that people often associate with first-class travel. This was the life she thought. All her sacrifices were beginning to pay off. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of gratitude. She'd worked multiple jobs, earned scholarships, and poured her heart into her non-profit. This seat felt like a well-deserved respite. However, as more passengers boarded, she began to notice the sidelong glances. Some of her fellow travelers paused, eyes narrowing as they passed. One man seemed to study her attire as though mentally recalculating whether Ebony truly belonged here. Another woman, fur coat draped over her arm, pursed her lips upon seeing Ebony comfortably seated. Ebony did her best to ignore them, focusing instead on her upcoming conference presentation. Shortly after, she noticed the tall gentleman from the Sky Club lounge. He took a seat in 14B, the row just behind business class. She gave him a brief smile when their gazes crossed. He offered a polite nod again, an unspoken acknowledgement of recognition. Ebony wondered why a man who looked so dignified wouldn't fly in first or business, but she shrugged the thought away, figuring not everyone needed the extra legroom or plush seats. The cabin door closed, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstrations. Ebony tried to concentrate on the instructions, but she couldn't shake off the sudden chill in the atmosphere. She felt a wave of discomfort, a prickly sense of not being welcome. The flight's departure was delayed slightly due to the inclement weather. She heard the captain announce a short taxi hold, giving Ebony more time to reflect on the stares and uneasy energy. Little did she know, the real storm was just about to begin. About half an hour into the flight, the plane stabilized at cruising altitude. Ebony clicked open her tray table, intending to resume her reading on the iPad. A flight attendant, different from Monica, who had initially greeted her, walked down the aisle, distributing menus for dinner. Her name tag read Cynthia. Cynthia handed menus to passengers in row 1, then row 2, but seemed to skip Ebony entirely, offering a menu to the passenger across the aisle, Mr. Landon, but glossing right over Ebony as though she was invisible. Ebony blinked in confusion. Perhaps it was just an oversight, she thought. Flight attendants get busy, especially during meal service. With a gentle smile, Ebony tried to catch Cynthia's attention. "Excuse me," Ebony called softly. "May I have a menu?" Cynthia turned her eyes distant. There was a momentary flicker of hesitation, and then a cursory smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she replied, though her tone lacked genuine warmth. She rummaged in her stack of menus before handing one to Ebony. "We're running low. Here you go." Ebony nodded, puzzled, but determined not to overreact. She perused the menu options, included a herb-crusted salmon, a roasted vegetable ravioli, and a beef tenderloin. She made her choice and waited for Cynthia to return to take orders. Minutes passed, and Ebony noticed Cynthia meticulously taking every other passenger's request in first class, even engaging them with friendly chatter. But when she came to Ebony, the flight attendant's tone shifted, becoming curt and distant. Ebony asked for the salmon, to which Cynthia simply nodded and moved on without a word. The sense of isolation grew stronger. Ebony tried to brush off the discomfort. She knew that reading too much into every slight could rob her of joy. She reminded herself that people had off days. But after dinner, orders were taken. Ebony realized her water glass was empty. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently for assistance. Several minutes ticked by. She noticed that across the aisle, Mr. Landon's request for an extra napkin was immediately fulfilled. The flight attendants looked busy, but Ebony's call light remained unanswered. Finally, Monica, the warmer, more welcoming flight attendant, passed by. Ebony gently tapped the armrest to get her attention. "I'm sorry to bother you," Ebony said, "but could I get a refill of sparkling water?" Monica glanced at the blinking call button above Ebony's seat and frowned. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Ms. Reynolds," she said, realizing Ebony had been ignored for quite some time. "Yes, of course, let me get that for you." Gratitude swelled in Ebony's chest, but the relief was overshadowed by a sinking feeling. This was no simple oversight. She was being overlooked, if not outright avoided. She tried to maintain her composure, taking calming breaths. Yet she couldn't help but notice other passengers observing the interactions, or lack thereof, between Ebony and Cynthia. Some had pity in their eyes, others looked mildly amused. Ebony braced herself, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but a nagging voice in her head told her that she'd seen this scenario before. As the dinner service began, Ebony was served last. By the time her salmon arrived, the sides were lukewarm, and the bread roll had lost its warmth altogether. She mustered the politest smile she could manage and thanked Cynthia anyway. The attendant's response was a terse nod, her lips pressed together in an expression that could only be described as disapproval. A swirl of mixed emotions coursed through Ebony: discomfort, hurt, and a simmering resentment that she tried desperately to keep in check. She focused on her meal, determined to make the best of an awkward situation. If this flight was going to be a test of her composure, so be it. She thought of the many women she represented, young women looking up to her, waiting for her to pave the way. She knew she had to remain composed. Throughout dinner, Ebony felt an almost tangible tension in the first-class cabin. Passengers engaged in small-talk laughter bubbled in corners of the compartment, but Ebony remained an island unto herself. At one point, she watched Cynthia approach Mr. Landon again to inquire if he needed anything else, coffee, dessert, or a top-up of wine. Ebony, on the other hand, received no such courtesy. She set her utensils down, appetite waning. "Pardon me, is everything all right?" a voice asked quietly. Ebony turned to see a middle-aged woman seated in 2B. She wore a stylish grey pantsuit and had a concerned expression. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Helena Moore, a psychologist traveling for a conference in Germany. She gently placed a hand on Ebony's armrest. "I noticed you've been kind of overlooked," Dr. Moore said, choosing her words carefully. Ebony forced a small smile, touched by the woman's concern. I'm fine, Ebony replied softly. Just a bit of a rough start. Dr. Moore nodded sympathetically. I'm sorry you're experiencing that, she said. If it continues, you should speak up. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Ebony appreciated the gesture. I might, she admitted, but I want to see if it's just a misunderstanding. They chatted briefly about their respective trips, Ebony's conference in London, Dr. Moore's talk in Berlin. The conversation eased some of Ebony's anxieties. For a moment, she felt less alone. Meanwhile, Ebony caught glimpses of the tall gentleman from the lounge, Ray Whitmore, who was still in 14B. Each time the curtain between business class and economy parted, Ebony noticed him quietly reading, occasionally glancing her way. Something about his calm demeanor struck her as unusual for a typical passenger. Yet Ebony dismissed the thought, focusing on her own predicament. Meal trays were cleared, and the cabin lights dimmed to encourage rest on the overnight flight. Ebony decided to use the in-flight Wi-Fi to answer a few emails and tweak her keynote slides. She reached into her laptop bag when she heard a voice nearby. It was Cynthia again. She was addressing Dr. Moore, handing her a customs form. Ebony realized she hadn't received hers yet. Excuse me, Ebony said politely. Could I also get a customs form? Cynthia's gaze flicked over Ebony, her eyes colder than ever. Do you need one? She asked, voice tinged with skepticism. Ebony blinked, taken aback by the insinuation. Yes, I do. I'm traveling internationally. Cynthia sighed, as though exasperated. I'll see if I can find another one, she said, walking away without further explanation. Dr. Moore, who witnessed the exchange, gave Ebony a concerned look. Ebony just shrugged, though inside she felt the sting of belittlement. Minutes later, Cynthia returned and practically tossed the form onto Ebony's tray table, not bothering with the courtesy she extended to others. Thanks, Ebony said, unable to keep a slight edge from her tone. Cynthia merely nodded and walked off. Ebony's blood simmered with frustration. She reminded herself to remain composed. She had no intention of starting a confrontation in mid-flight, but the blatant disrespect was becoming impossible to ignore. Even Dr. Moore mouthed a silent apology from across the aisle, as if to say, I'm sorry this is happening. Ebony tried to bury herself in work, but her thoughts churned. She couldn't help wondering if it was her race. She was the only black passenger in first class, and it wouldn't be the first time prejudice manifested in microaggressions like being ignored or given inferior service. But was that really what this was? Or was she being overly sensitive? She recalled incidents in her past, being followed around a high-end store as a teenager, being pulled aside for random checks more often than her peers, hearing strangers question whether she belonged at Ivy League networking events. Those memories still stung. And here, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, Ebony could do little to escape the feeling of being under an invisible microscope. Some might say she was overthinking it, but she knew from experience that this uneasy sixth sense was often right on target. Deciding not to let bitterness consume her, Ebony put on noise-canceling headphones and watched a movie, hoping to distract herself. But every so often she'd glance around and see Cynthia doting on other passengers. The contrast was painful. Dr. Moore handed Ebony a small packet of tissues at one point. In case you need them, she whispered gently. Ebony didn't realize her eyes had welled up with tears of frustration. She accepted the tissues gratefully, inhaling a shaky breath. She felt an odd mix of anger and heartbreak. Here she was, a professional woman who had sacrificed so much to get where she was, yet she still faced these demeaning slights. Meanwhile, Ebony also noticed that Monica, the kinder flight attendant, seemed troubled. She would occasionally glance at Ebony and Cynthia as though aware that something was amiss. Monica came by once with a tray of after-dinner mints and discreetly slipped an extra mint onto Ebony's table. "Are you feeling all right, Miss Reynolds?" Monica asked, the genuine warmth returning to her voice. Ebony paused, deliberating whether to voice her concerns. "I'm okay," she said softly. She didn't want to cause a scene, nor did she want to put Monica in a difficult position. Monica likely had to maintain a professional rapport with her co-worker, Cynthia. Still, Ebony sensed that Monica knew something wasn't right. "If you need anything, please let me know," Monica said, casting a fleeting glance toward the galley where Cynthia stood. Ebony nodded appreciatively. She felt a measure of comfort in knowing that at least one crew member was empathetic. An hour later, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and overhead fins rattled. Ebony, feeling the plane shudder, clutched her armrest. She wasn't a nervous flyer, but the storm outside was formidable. Lightning flashed in the distance, and the entire aircraft shivered under the onslaught of wind gusts. Cynthia reappeared in the cabin, instructing people to secure loose items. She briskly walked past Ebony without a second glance. As she checked seatbelts, Ebony noticed her giving extra care to the passengers in rows 1 and 3. When Cynthia reached Ebony's row, she barely slowed down. Dr. Moore had to flag her down to ask for help with a jammed seatbelt. Ebony tried to breathe through the tension. The turbulence was bad enough without the added stress of being singled out for poor treatment. She wondered if she should say something to Cynthia directly, but part of her feared it would only escalate matters. As the turbulence intensified, Ebony's heart pounded not from fear of flying, but from the emotional distress of being made to feel unwelcome in a space she had every right to occupy. When the turbulence subsided and the seatbelt sign switched off, Ebony noticed a quiet commotion at the entrance to first class. The tall gentleman from 14B, Ray Whitmore, was speaking with Monica. Ebony couldn't hear the words, but she observed Monica's respectful demeanor. Ray nodded, then cast a long glance in Ebony's direction. Something about his posture suggested quiet authority. Ebony found it odd that a passenger from economy, or maybe premium economy, would stroll into first class without resistance. Yet Monica was treating him as if he had every right to be there. For a moment, Ray caught Ebony's eye, offering another one of those polite, reassuring nods. Ebony gave a tentative smile, puzzled by what was unfolding. Did he see how she was being treated? Was he concerned? Ray retreated back through the curtain, leaving Ebony to wonder. She tried to refocus on her work, but minutes later she noticed Cynthia walking hurriedly toward the galley, her face tense. Monica followed, and hushed voices erupted in the small corridor. Ebony could only catch snippets. "I don't care who he is," and "We have a duty to all our passengers." Ebony's curiosity piqued. Could this be about her? Shortly afterward, Dr. Moore leaned over. "I'm sorry if this is intrusive," she began softly, "but I think you should know I overheard a bit of the flight attendant's conversation. The gentleman who was just here might be someone important." Ebony raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Dr. Moore shrugged. "I couldn't catch everything, but Monica seemed to be cautioning Cynthia about how she was treating passengers in first class. Something about company policy." Ebony sighed, glancing out the window. The clouds had parted, revealing a sliver of moonlight. She whispered almost to herself, "I just want to get to London in peace." "I understand," Dr. Moore said, her voice full of empathy. "But if this continues, you should speak to someone in authority, maybe even the head flight attendant." Ebony nodded. She was torn. She wanted to stand up for herself, but part of her wanted no more drama. This flight was only so many hours, and then she'd be in London. Yet the resentment continued to brew. She reminded herself that staying silent often perpetuated the same injustices she fought against in her everyday work. Just as Ebony was weighing her options, Cynthia returned to the first-class cabin. She made a beeline for Ebony's seat. "Miss Reynolds," she said, emphasizing the miss with a biting edge, "I need to confirm your seat details. Could you show me your boarding pass again?" Ebony's eyes widened. "My boarding pass? You already saw it when I boarded." She reached into her purse, her pulse quickening. "Is there a problem?" Cynthia's lips curled into a tight smile. "We've had reports of passengers sneaking into upgraded seats, just making sure everything is above board." A hot flush of anger rushed through Ebony's body. She handed over the pass, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "Here it is. I was legitimately upgraded and I paid for this seat." Cynthia examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny. "It appears correct," she said, finally returning it. "But let me remind you that if there's any misrepresentation, it's grounds for removal from first class. Enjoy the rest of your flight." The insinuation hung thick in the air that Ebony didn't belong here, that she might be some kind of imposter. Dr. Moore gaped in disbelief. A few other passengers glanced over equally shocked. Ebony swallowed her pride tears, threatening to spill. But she refused to give Cynthia the satisfaction of seeing her break. She forced herself to remain calm, even though her chest felt like it was on fire. "I can't believe she just did that," Dr. Moore murmured as Cynthia strode away. Ebony closed her eyes, breathing deeply. This wasn't just microaggression anymore. This was outright hostility. She felt her hands tremble. She decided right then and there that she wouldn't let it go unanswered. Moments later, Monica appeared again, looking visibly uneasy. "Ms. Reynolds," she began, her voice quavering slightly, "I'm the senior flight attendant on this shift. I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding you've encountered. If there's anything I can do to improve your experience." Ebony looked up, her gaze unwavering. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I'd like to know if the airline endorses the way Cynthia is treating me. She just insinuated that I might be in this seat illegally." Monica's cheeks flushed. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "Cynthia is following up on a passenger complaint." "But what passenger complaint?" Ebony interrupted. "Who complained that I was in the wrong seat?" Monica hesitated. "I can't reveal specific details, but please believe me that we take this seriously. We don't want any passenger to feel unwelcome or singled out. If you wish to file a complaint, I can provide the forms." Ebony nodded, exhaling slowly. "I'll think about it. Right now, I just want to get through the rest of this flight in peace." Monica nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Ebony's tray table. "I'll do everything I can to ensure that." After Monica left, Ebony felt a small measure of relief. At least one person on this plane seemed to understand that she was being mistreated. Yet she also knew from experience that official apologies and forms often led nowhere. Actions spoke louder than words, and so far, Cynthia's actions screamed prejudice. Half an hour later, Ebony decided to use the restroom at the front of the plane. She got up, making her way past the curtained partition. She felt the eyes of some passengers trailing her, a reminder that she was indeed a rarity in this exclusive cabin. After washing her hands, she stepped back into the aisle, only to find Ray Whitmore standing there, seemingly waiting for her. "Excuse me," Ebony said politely, trying to move past. But Ray raised a hand gently. "Ms. Reynolds, right?" he asked. His voice was calm, yet authoritative. Ebony frowned slightly. "Yes. Have we met?" Not formally, Ray replied with a disarming smile, but I've heard about what's going on with your seat assignment. I'm sorry you're having this experience. Ebony's eyes widened. How do you know about that? Ray cast a glance around, then lowered his voice. I'm Ray Whitmore. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Delta Airlines. I happened to be on this flight doing an unannounced check on passenger experience. I sat back in row 14 by choice. A jumble of emotions swept through Ebony: surprise, relief, disbelief. You're the CEO, she echoed. It dawned on her that his quiet presence in 14B suddenly made sense. I had no idea. Ray nodded. I keep a low profile when I travel like this. It helps me see the real operations without the polish. I've been watching tonight, and I'm very concerned about the service you've been receiving. I want to personally apologize on behalf of Delta Airlines. Ebony stood frozen for a moment, her anger and frustration boiling over into a rare mixture of validation and relief. So she wasn't imagining things. A top executive had seen it firsthand. Thank you, she managed to say. I appreciate your acknowledgement. It's been difficult. Ray's expression was serious. I understand. If you don't mind, I'd like to address this issue immediately. May I escort you back to your seat? Ebony hesitated. The entire situation was surreal. Finally, she nodded. If the CEO of the airline was offering to intervene, who was she to refuse? Ray walked Ebony back to her seat, and the hush that fell over first class was palpable. Passengers who had been indifferent or even judgmental seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. Cynthia, noticing Ray's presence, approached cautiously. Sir, she began, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Is there anything I can do for you? Ray didn't mince words. Yes, actually. I'd like to speak with you about Miss Reynolds' experience. Let's step into the galley. Cynthia's face blanched. She led the way, and Ray invited Ebony to follow. Standing in the cramped galley, with Monica behind them for moral support, Ebony watched as Ray calmly addressed Cynthia. I've observed some troubling behavior tonight, Ray said. It appears Ms. Reynolds has been repeatedly overlooked, questioned about her seat legitimacy, and generally treated in a manner inconsistent with Delta's standards. Cynthia sputtered, Sir, I was just following protocol. We had a complaint. Ray's eyebrow arched. And did you verify the nature of that complaint before treating Ms. Reynolds differently from every other passenger in first class? Cynthia's gaze darted between Ray and Ebony. I tried to do my job, sir. Ray's voice remained calm but firm. Delta's job is to ensure all passengers are treated equally with dignity and respect. If you received a complaint, you should have resolved it politely and discreetly, not targeted Ms. Reynolds. From my observation, your demeanor and actions were inappropriate and hostile. Cynthia bristled, but Ray silenced her with a raised hand. We value each passenger who flies with us, regardless of background. I need you to apologize to Ms. Reynolds immediately and rectify any lapses in service. A heavy silence hung in the air. Ebony could see the battle raging behind Cynthia's eyes, anger, embarrassment, perhaps even guilt. Eventually, Cynthia mumbled, I'm sorry if you felt mistreated, Ms. Reynolds. That wasn't my intention. Ebony knew it was half-hearted, but she accepted it with a nod, simply wanting this ordeal to end. Ray, however, wasn't satisfied. Cynthia, I expect you to address Ms. Reynolds with respect and ensure she has everything she needs for the remainder of this flight. Understood, yes, sir, Cynthia said, her voice barely audible. Ray turned to Ebony. If you need anything else, Ms. Reynolds, please let Monica or me know. Ebony nodded, gratitude welling up. She returned to her seat, and Dr. Moore shot her a smile of relief. The rest of first class seemed to buzz with subdued chatter. Everyone was curious about what had just happened. But Ebony felt a measure of vindication, a sense that justice had momentarily prevailed. A little while later, Ray approached Ebony's seat once more. He glanced around, then leaned in with a quiet smile. "May I sit here for a moment?" Ebony gestured for him to take the aisle seat. He settled down, looking both concerned and compassionate. "I wanted to check on you. Sometimes an apology from a flight attendant doesn't fix the sense of hurt or humiliation. How are you doing?" Ebony considered the question. She still felt raw, but also relieved that her ordeal was validated by someone with real authority. "Thank you for asking," she said. "I'm better, I guess. I appreciate that you stepped in." Ray nodded. "The dignity of our passengers is paramount. I hate that you had to go through this. I've spent years building a culture at Delta that's supposed to be welcoming, and this goes against everything we stand for." Ebony looked down at her folded hands. "I was beginning to think no one would see or believe what was happening." Ray's expression softened. He reached out tentatively, and Ebony allowed him to gently squeeze her hand. Then, in a spontaneous gesture that spoke volumes, Ray stood up and extended his arms, inviting Ebony into a hug. She paused, surprised by such warmth from a company's CEO, but then she rose and accepted. The hug was brief, yet powerful, a tangible reassurance that she mattered, that she was seen. At that moment, a ripple of awe passed through the cabin. A few passengers craned their necks to see. Dr. Moore smiled softly, and even Monica stood a few rows away, tears glistening in her eyes. It was a hug that transcended mere formalities, an acknowledgement of Ebony's humanity and worth. For Ebony, it felt like a healing balm on a deep wound. As Ray left Ebony's seat, a quiet hush followed him. Passengers who had been aloof earlier now wore thoughtful expressions. Some looked uneasy, perhaps aware that they had judged Ebony prematurely. Others seemed impressed that the airline's top executive would so openly side with one passenger against a member of his own staff. A man in row 3, who had earlier given Ebony a dismissive glance, suddenly nodded at her. She noticed his shift in posture, as though acknowledging that he'd been wrong to assume anything about her. A younger couple across the aisle whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Ebony with apologetic eyes. Dr. Moore leaned over once more. "That was remarkable," she said softly. "How do you feel?" Ebony let out a long breath. "Grateful mostly, and vindicated, but also tired," she confessed. "I wish I didn't need the CEO's hug to feel like I belong here." Dr. Moore gave her a sympathetic nod. "That's the saddest part of all. But at least there was someone with power who witnessed what happened and cared enough to act. That rarely happens." Ebony squeezed Dr. Moore's hand gratefully. Then she sank back into her seat, wishing for nothing more than a few hours of uninterrupted rest. She could still feel the flight crew and other passengers casting curious glances her way, but at least the hostility had subsided. For a while, Ebony closed her eyes, drifting in and out of a shallow sleep. Sometime later, she awoke to hushed voices in the galley. She recognized Monica's voice, and then she heard Cynthia's raised in protest. "I've been here for 15 years, Cynthia was saying. "Who does he think he is, humiliating me like that?" Monica responded quietly, something about company policy and reports of repeated issues. Ebony realized that Ray must have taken immediate steps to address the situation. It occurred to her that Cynthia might face consequences beyond a stern lecture. Ebony felt a pang of guilt. She didn't want to see someone lose their job. But she also recognized that unchecked prejudice had real victims, and Cynthia's behavior could not simply be excused. She heard Cynthia say, "I will not apologize again," followed by footsteps stomping down the aisle. Ebony pretended to be asleep as Cynthia passed by, feeling the anger radiating off the attendant. Moments later, Monica and Ray walked together toward the back of the plane. Ebony guessed that some official disciplinary action might be underway. After the cabin lights were turned down once more, Ebony felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Mr. Landon, the passenger who had been seated across the aisle. He was a well-dressed man in his 60s with a neatly trimmed mustache. Earlier, Ebony had noticed him politely ignoring the drama, keeping to himself. "Ma'am," he said, speaking in a hushed tone, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you went through that. It's not right." Ebony offered a faint smile. "Thank you, I appreciate it." Mr. Landon shifted uncomfortably. "I used to work in human resources," he admitted, "and I've seen discrimination take many forms, but rarely so blatant. I should have spoken up earlier." Ebony shook her head. "It's okay. It's a complicated situation, and I wouldn't expect you to risk conflict on a plane." He extended a business card. "If you ever need help or want a witness statement, feel free to reach out. I might be able to testify if it goes that far." Ebony accepted the card, touched by the gesture. "Thank you truly." One by one, a few other passengers expressed similar sentiments, quiet words of remorse or support. It was bittersweet. Ebony appreciated their concern, but she also wondered why no one had intervened earlier. Was it fear? Indifference? Regardless, the tide seemed to have turned in her favor. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Monica took over Ebony's service personally, offering coffee, dessert, and breakfast options with genuine warmth. Cynthia remained noticeably absent. Ebony gathered that she was either reassigned or chose to remain out of sight for the remainder of the journey. Ray spent most of his time in the back, presumably making notes and observing staff interactions. When the plane finally landed at Heathrow Airport, Ebony felt a wave of relief. The oppressive tension that had weighed on her since takeoff began to dissipate. She grabbed her carry-on and waited for the cabin door to open. Dr. Moore stood beside her, exchanging contact information so they could possibly meet up for coffee in Europe. Ebony felt a sense of camaraderie with this compassionate stranger. As they deplaned, Ray was waiting near the exit personally, thanking each passenger. When Ebony stepped up, he offered a handshake. "Ms. Reynolds, I'll be in touch," he said. "Our airline will follow up to ensure that what happened on this flight doesn't happen again. And I hope you'll accept a formal invitation from our Diversity and Inclusion Council. I believe we have a lot to learn from someone like you." Ebony's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. That's incredible. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." Ray smiled. "Enjoy your time in London, and know that Delta appreciates your business and your voice." With that, Ebony stepped off the plane, her emotions swirling. Exhaustion mingled with relief and a strange exhilaration at having found an unexpected ally at 35,000 feet. The hustle and bustle of Heathrow enveloped her, but she felt light, unburdened. She wasn't sure what the future held for Cynthia or how the airline would handle the matter in the long run, but at least for now, she had been seen and she had been heard. Within days of Ebony settling into her London hotel, news of the flight incident had somehow leaked onto social media. Perhaps a fellow passenger had snapped a photo of Ray hugging Ebony and posted it, or maybe Dr. Moore had shared the story with a colleague who then tweeted about it. Regardless, it became a minor sensation online. Posts praised Ray Whitmore for stepping in, but more than that, they sparked larger conversations about racism and bias in the airline industry. Delta's press office released a statement. Delta Airlines maintains a strict policy of zero tolerance for discrimination. We are currently investigating an incident on Flight 45 from Atlanta to London. Our CEO, Raymond Whitmore, was personally on board and has initiated measures to ensure that all passengers receive fair and respectful treatment. Privately, Ebony received an email from Delta's HR department requesting her statement. She carefully detailed the events of the flight. 2 days later, she learned that Cynthia had been placed on indefinite suspension pending the investigation. Ebony felt conflicted. No one wanted to see another person's livelihood in jeopardy. Yet she also knew that letting it slide would condone such behavior. The backlash was not limited to Cynthia alone. A rumored internal memo indicated that flight attendants throughout the company were reminded of their training protocols on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was the hard karma, hitting back an entire system forced to re-examine itself because one woman refused to silently endure mistreatment. Despite the upheaval, Ebony delivered a triumphant keynote address at the Diversity and Inclusion Conference. Her speech covered the importance of creating spaces where marginalized voices could thrive. She concluded with a personal anecdote without naming names about how a single incident on a plane reminded her that vigilance was necessary at all times. Her words resonated. Attendees flocked to speak with her afterward, sharing similar stories of microaggressions and outright discrimination they had encountered in professional environments. Ebony realized this was bigger than her personal ordeal. It was a call to action. As Ebony stepped out of the auditorium into the crisp London air, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ray Whitmore's secretary inviting her to a meeting at Delta's corporate offices upon her return. Ebony's heart lifted. Perhaps real change was on the horizon. After the conference, Ebony decided to stay in London for a few extra days, hoping to recharge and explore. She received another surprising phone call. A prominent civil rights attorney had seen her story on social media and offered pro bono services if Ebony wished to pursue legal action. Ebony hesitated. Suing wasn't her first impulse. She wanted transformation, not just compensation. Around the same time, Ebony also received an invitation to appear on a morning talk show in the United States to discuss her experience. She weighed the pros and cons. On one hand, it could shine a light on systemic issues. On the other hand, it could thrust her into an unwelcome spotlight. In the end, Ebony decided to accept the interview offer provided they focused on solutions rather than sensationalizing the incident. She wanted to steer the narrative toward fostering empathy and inclusion rather than pointing fingers. The show agreed, and Ebony prepared herself for a new wave of public attention. When Ebony flew back to the United States, a week later again on Delta Airlines, she was met at the gate by a station manager who escorted her to a private lounge. A bouquet of flowers and a handwritten note from Ray awaited her. "Thank you for your courage, Ebony. We are committed to doing better." The second flight experience was markedly different. The staff, seemingly aware of her presence, were extraordinarily courteous. While Ebony appreciated the improved service, she also felt a pang of sadness that it took a public controversy and the CEO's intervention to secure something as basic as dignity. Nonetheless, she arrived home with renewed hope. Her phone buzzed non-stop with interview requests, messages of support, and inquiries from other women who had experienced similar discrimination. Ebony took it all in stride, determined to leverage the moment for positive change rather than personal gain. A few weeks later, Ebony found herself in a sleek conference room at Delta's corporate headquarters. Tall windows overlooked the Atlanta skyline, and a polished table stretched the length of the room. Members of Delta's Diversity and Inclusion Council filled the seats, waiting for Ray and Ebony to present a joint initiative. When Ray entered the room, fell silent. He greeted Ebony warmly, then addressed the council. "I've brought Ms. Ebony Reynolds here today because her story illuminated blind spots in our training and culture," he began. "We need to do better, and I want her insights." Ebony felt a surge of nerves. She took a breath, then stood to speak. For the next hour, she shared anecdotes, statistics, and strategies for addressing bias. She highlighted the power of bystander intervention, the need for continuous education, and the importance of accountability from top to bottom. During the Q&A, one council member asked Ms. Reynolds, "What do you think is the most critical step for us to ensure such incidents never happen again?" Ebony's response was immediate: empathy-building exercises. You can't train away prejudice with a one-time workshop. It's an ongoing conversation that involves listening deeply to marginalized voices. When people see the humanity in each other, respect follows naturally. By the end of the meeting, Ebony had earned a standing ovation. Ray announced plans to incorporate Ebony's recommendations into Delta's updated training modules. While Ebony knew institutional change wouldn't happen overnight, it felt like a real step forward. Several months later, Ebony heard from a contact within Delta that Cynthia had been terminated. The investigation had uncovered multiple complaints from past passengers, including some who were also people of color. Ebony felt conflicted. Part of her believed that, with better training, Cynthia might have reformed, but the other part recognized that her repeated offenses indicated a pattern, not a mere lapse in judgment. Karma had arrived, delivering consequences for behavior that had likely gone unchecked for years. Ebony didn't celebrate Cynthia's downfall, but she acknowledged that accountability was necessary. If a single flight could catalyze such far-reaching changes, perhaps it was worth the turmoil she had endured. In the weeks that followed, Ebony's inbox overflowed with invitations from universities, non-profits, and Fortune 500 companies alike. What had begun as a painful ordeal on a single transatlantic flight had now become a national conversation. She was no longer just the woman who had been mistreated in first class. She was a living example of what happens when injustice meets both resistance and recognition from the top. Her story had struck a chord not just because of what happened, but because of how she had carried herself through it. People admired her grace under pressure, her ability to remain dignified even when confronted by hostility. That grace became her signature strength, and now organizations were eager to learn from it. One morning, Ebony stood before an auditorium of aspiring airline professionals at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. As she scanned the room, she saw eager faces, most of them young, and some of them young black women who looked at her as if they were seeing their own future reflected back. It moved her deeply. She shared her journey, not just the events on the flight, but the years of persistence, scholarship rejections, microaggressions, and triumphs that led up to it. "I didn't set out to be a symbol," she told them, "but sometimes the world chooses your moment. And when that moment comes, your only job is to answer it with truth." Inspired by her experience and the overwhelming support she'd received, Ebony launched the Skyline Sisters Initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program aimed at empowering young black women pursuing careers in aviation hospitality and travel leadership. With Delta Airlines as the founding sponsor, the initiative offered more than financial aid, it offered belonging. Ray Whitmore himself spoke at the inaugural fundraiser. Ebony didn't just teach Delta a lesson, he told the crowd. She reminded us of who we claim to be and who we must work every day to become. The night ended with a standing ovation. As Ebony stepped off the stage, one of the scholarship recipients, barely 19 years old, ran up to her, eyes shining with tears. "You made me believe I can be in spaces like this," she said. Ebony hugged her gently. "You don't just belong in these spaces," she whispered. "You're meant to lead them." It was in moments like this that Ebony felt the full weight and beauty of her legacy, not built on fame or fury, but on compassion, courage, and the quiet power of being seen. Late one evening, months after the incident, Ebony scrolled through her phone. She stopped at the photo of Ray hugging her on the plane. It was a powerful image, two people from vastly different worlds sharing a moment of mutual respect. Ebony smiled, remembering how that hug had felt like a lifeline in a storm. In the end, the flight that began with anxiety and discrimination concluded with hope and solidarity. It proved that small acts like a CEO standing up in empathy could spark large-scale changes. And it reaffirmed Ebony's belief in her own worth, reminding her that no one had the right to make her feel less than human, no matter how exclusive the setting. Ebony closed her eyes, gratitude washing over her. She thought of every young girl of color who felt unwelcome in spaces of privilege. She hoped that her story would remind them that they too belonged. And she prayed that the seeds of empathy planted in one airline cabin would continue to grow, touching many more lives along the way. Ebony Reynolds' journey taught us that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with one courageous stand at 35,000 feet in the air. Her experience exposed painful truths about prejudice, but it also revealed the power of compassion and accountability when wielded by those in high places. By standing up for herself, Ebony didn't just secure her own dignity. She ignited a chain reaction that redefined how an entire airline approached diversity and respect. If this story moved you, stirred your heart, or made you think twice about how we treat one another, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. By spreading tales like Ebony's, we amplify vital conversations on equality, empathy, and justice. Together, we can continue creating spaces on the ground and in the skies where everyone is truly seen and welcomed. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice can spark real change.